about me and a little bit about Biotecture. My background is as a civil engineer. One of my first projects was working on the Channel Tunnel. And over the years working in civils, I got more and more distressed about the misuse of natural materials. How could we work more in tune with nature? How could we harness the power of plants to do good in our cities? And so along with a landscape designer, I co-founded Biotecture in 2007. Biotecture stands for biological architecture, and it has grown into one of the leading living wall companies in the world. We're now really proud to be a part of the Mighty Group too. As such, we can offer holistic in-house solutions, net zero, etc., around the whole sustainability and what we would call the green envelope. So what I'm going to do today is just go through to inform and inspire in terms of what is green infrastructure, why do we think green infrastructure is important, and to give some sort of messaging and tools around that. Where do living walls fit in as a subset of green infrastructure? And then a little bit about the kind of history and evolution of green walls and how they've kind of grown up. And then looking at a few different ways of vertical greening. I'm also going to touch on compliance and CSR, but that's really one for a more detailed presentation, which is in the next webinar. Then I'm going to give you 3 examples of where we're demonstrably adding value through vertical green infrastructure. So really this first webinar is a toolkit to inspire and to inform. So first of all, what is green infrastructure? There's an academic group called the Reclaim Network who operate or are centred in the University of Surrey, and they're studying green, blue and grey infrastructure, so GBGI, so green infrastructure, green walls, blue infrastructure, potentially blue roofs or canals or swales, which could also be green and blue infrastructure, and then maybe cycleways looking at grey infrastructure. And they've identified 51 different types of GBGI or green and blue and grey infrastructure. And they're currently running through a whole scientific review of the science papers on the efficacy of these different intervention measures. But I think it's really important for us to recognise what green infrastructure is and how we work with it. And my favourite definition of green infrastructure is this infographic from Arup's City Alive's document, because this is the realm in which we work. We're talking about green infrastructure being deliberate and man-made, so intervention measures that are seeking to introduce green into our urban environments for a number of reasons that I'll go into in the why green infrastructure section. And effectively, when we start to look at what's in Arup City Alive thing here, I characterise them into 4 spaces. We have green roofs and podium slabs, so we have areas of horizontal landscaping that are on man-made structures. We then have the park spaces where you can have pocket parks and linear parks. We then have the vertical structures, where we start and where we excel, which is the green walls, which might be climbers and fully comprehensive green wall systems that, again, I'll go into a bit later. And the 4th subset, which I think is really important, particularly in northern climes like where we are, is the internal landscape as well, and how it's important to have green infrastructure in that internal landscape too. So look, here's some examples of that sort of level of green infrastructure, and I think they're really inspiring in terms of how they impact on people and spaces and places, and just the way in which these linear parks, like the top left, which is the New York High Line, can really become a destination space where people can breathe, relax, be in nature whilst they're in the middle of the cities. In the bottom, in the middle, you have a lovely green park, linear park, running up the side of a, or linear horticultural feature running up the side of a road with a swale running into it. So that's looking at stormwater attenuation. So there's various different ways in which we can start to introduce green infrastructure for a number of different reasons. So moving into those reasons, looking at why green infrastructure. There are multiple and holistic reasons why green infrastructure needs to be thought of as part of our future urban environment. Again, looking at the Reclaim Network, the academic body who are studying into this, multiple universities, but centred around the University of Surrey, they've identified 7 headline ways in which green infrastructure can help in urban areas. Number 1, thermally, both building thermal comfort, but also the more general urban heat island effect. Secondly, biodiversity. Thirdly, water attenuation, particularly the attenuation of stormwater. Noise attenuation would be another one. Air pollution reduction, and also the impact that green can have on us in terms of our own health and well-being. And so we look at green infrastructure as a nature-based solution, and for so many interconnected reasons, nature-based solutions need to be considered as a vital part of any sustainable urban placemaking. And I'm going to quickly just explore two of those reasons and how green infrastructure can help. So firstly, let's look at some of the thermal issues. We're looking at climates that are starting to go a bit wonky, is probably the only way I can describe them. And there are a number of studies that look at how climate change is going to impact cities by 2050. Cities is where more than 70% of the urban population lives, so it's pretty important that we have suitable environments in which people can live. And there's some pretty interesting statistics here, and it's not very far away. 2050 is only 26 years and 3 months away from where we are now. And we know we suffered in London that week in July last year of 40-degree heat. Well, there's just literally this week been an independent climate resilience report where an interim report on that study has found that London could experience multiple 45-degree C days in the foreseeable future. And Sadiq Khan said this is potentially buckling various basic functions of the city. It means the underground is not fit for purpose. Summer homes are too hot in the daytime, care homes and schools too. It means we have to adapt to these temperatures now. It's now time for those who are delaying action to wake up and smell the coffee, because this is happening now. So we have this interesting real problem of temperature and how that's going to impact into cities, and its impact on heart attacks and asthma, etc. as well. So there's a real health issue coming in here. And how can green infrastructure? Well, just a quick demonstration of how green infrastructure can help. If we look at this thermal, excuse me, just skipped over one. If we look at this thermal comfort graph here, we are seeing that this is in London, in Holborn, and the brick wall on the left-hand side is about, with the sun shining straight on it, is about 40 degrees. The green wall on the right-hand side is about 22 degrees. How is this going to impact primary energy? How is this going to impact thermal comfort? And if we do it at scale, what sort of an impact could we have on being resilient in terms of urban heat island? And the second example I want to pick out is on biodiversity. At Biotecture, we've been seeking for years to reconnect people with nature, and that's one of our fundamental tenets of what we want to do. Sadly, it's really clear that humans and nature have never been disconnected, and our impact on nature is sadly very obvious with the 6th extinction event going on at the moment with the biodiversity collapse. So again, we need to start looking at this as part of the holistic work. And again, a way that green infrastructure can help. I'll just show you a very quick few seconds of this video. And this is taken at the top of Edgware Road, a living wall we've installed for 12 years. You can see the traffic on the right. The living wall was installed on the back of some clean air funding for that, and we have a number of bits of test data on how useful the living wall has been in terms of cleaning particulate matter particularly, but also you can see the bees. The bees are there and really enjoying themselves. So this is part of the holistic way in which green infrastructure can help to deal with the multiple issues that are around. And one of the points that I wanted to make around sustainability and green infrastructure is there is a current modern focus on net zero carbon, which is really, really important, but it's not going to impact those temperatures by 2050. It may impact temperatures by 2100, but it's not really going to have much of an impact in the next 10 or 20 years. And just because we can measure net zero carbon doesn't mean that we shouldn't be taking a holistic view towards how we can deal with the climate emergency at the moment, because unlike a financial accounting where there's one bottom line, environmental and social accounting has multiple bottom lines with tipping points all over the place, and we don't even know where those tipping points are. So we need to have these holistic solutions, and this is where green infrastructure comes in. And just before I come on to the living walls element of this, it's really important to understand why it is that green infrastructure, or why it is that being in plants or around plants is really good for us. And I believe that it's the combination of the physical properties of plants, the fact that they give us the perfect cocktail of air for our lungs to breathe globally. It's only when we have man-made local events in cities and some natural disasters that the air quality will reduce. So the perfect cocktail of air. Nature, plants provide us with food, shelter, medicines. And then there's the biophilic connection that we have with nature that is for our well-being, for our mood, for our recovery times from illnesses, which science proves are faster if we have a view of nature. I myself have been through this in terms of mental health issues and being able to go walking in the countryside just to restore what's going on. And at a very basic, simple level, being in or looking at nature reduces heart rate and blood pressure. And so having that balance of nature around us is really, really important. Often we have a 5-day, 2-day balance where we spend 5 days outside nature, just in offices or wherever we might be. And then we have 2 days where we get to go and escape to nature, to go walking, to go and do what we want. We want to try and redress that balance. And so where do living walls fit into this whole conversation around green infrastructure and around the benefits that they can give us? Well, I think it's really interesting with green walls in terms of them providing us with that reconnection with nature. Looking at green walls, having green walls in the area, really helps us to just balance our lives. And in the ultra urban zone, space is at a premium, both literally and financially. And so putting plants on walls makes perfect sense because we're not taking up the floor space to do that. There's also evidence on a number of factors that actually green walls can perform better than horizontal landscapes. For example, air pollution reduction has been shown that green walls will take air out of urban street canyons, take polluted air out of urban street canyons much better than horizontal landscapes. And being generally evergreen, they can do so year round. And it's not just the outdoor environment, it's also the indoor environment as well, where we can, having a view of a plant is restorative to us. There is a scientific theory called attention restoration theory, or ART, which suggests that when we spend time in nature, it balances us. It allows us to recoup and restore because we're staring into effectively something that isn't linear, and that doesn't, it's something very natural that allows us, when we come back to our more man-made processes of staring at computer screens or Gantt charts or whatever it might be, to actually be more effective because we've had that time spent in nature. And so there's also been a study by JCDecaux on eyeline, on where people get the best benefits. And for JCDecaux, it's about advertising, and they talk about dwell time. And they've noticed that the best dwell time is between about knee level and maybe 2-3 meters up in the air. That's the space in which to capture people's attention. And so when we want to put some green infrastructure in, there's nothing better than a green wall to fill into that space, to provide that restorative nature before we then go back to our work and become more productive, creative, and then it's good for staff retention, etc., etc. So a bit about the history and evolution of green walls. Really, they're nothing new. If we think back 4,000 years ago, we think Hanging Gardens of Babylon, in terms of deliberately bringing nature into cities. But the first kind of time that it was really thought through was this guy called Stanley Hart-White, and in 1938 he was at the University of Illinois, and he produced the very first patent for green walls, and his patent was called Vegetation Bearing Architectonic Structure and System. It never went beyond prototype stage, but it was the kind of forerunner to a lot of thinking about how can we deliberately introduce vertical green into our cities. And the next guy to come along was this guy, Patrick Blanc. Patrick Blanc is an absolute pioneer. He's an absolute visionary. He is a French botanist, I've had the absolute pleasure to work with Patrick on 2 projects, one in 2007 and one just earlier this year as well. And Patrick's interest is more in botany than architecture or structures or irrigation. He's more interested in which plants from where around the world he can introduce. And so, in fact, it's from Patrick's botany that we then introduced the idea of the architecture and the cladding panels and etc. to try to match the two. So we call it botanic architecture. And that's why we're trying to look at how that all sits and fits and works. So Patrick, absolute visionary, and his work is a real inspiration to us all. And then in the same pioneering way, in the UK, we started putting in green walls, and this is in the mid-2000s. And this is Paradise Park in Islington, a famous study of a failing green wall. Actually, not installed by Biotecture. Actually, it's a system that was never going to work, but it was a good try. We got called in actually to review why the system had failed, and there are a number of reasons which I can go into if anybody's interested, but there is nothing so poor as a bad looking piece of green infrastructure. And I think the blue plastic bag hanging in the middle of the green wall just really typifies how poor this is. And we don't want this within the green infrastructure world. We don't want this in the green world. This is in the past. This is 15, 20 years ago now. We're now looking at being able to be resilient with robust monitoring of irrigation systems. We don't get those sorts of failures anymore. It just doesn't happen. Here's New Street Square. This is in the centre of London, commissioned by Land Securities. We installed in 2011. It went through its 10-year anniversary in 2021. We've looked after it ever since. And last year, in 2022, it won the best horticultural display in the City of London, as given by the Worshipful Company of Gardeners. So 11 years after install, we're now able to install robust, resilient, and still beautiful green infrastructure. And then this year, this is working with Patrick Blanc as the designer and the Biotecture as the grower, installer, etc. We've worked with MacArthur Glen to deliver this stunning project in Paris. And this is just an extraordinary riot of colour that allows for that sort of retail environment and experience of man and nature in really kind of feeling relaxed and together in harmony. And I'll come back to something on MacArthur Glen when I start to look at some of the demonstrable benefits that we've got. So that's where we are today. Where are green walls going in the future? So I believe that green walls in the future will have all of the benefits that we talked about and all of those features that we looked at, but there'll be an increasing reliance in terms of specification on ecosystem services. So when we look at the image on the left, which is Vincent Calibo is a visionary French architect. This is his vision of Paris in 2050 in response to that climate change or the climate potential for Paris, when Paris is alleged to or will have modelled to have the same climate as Dakar in Senegal in 2050, as Dakar in Senegal does now. So that's intense periods of rainfall interspersed with long, hot, dry periods. And how are we building our cities that in a way to cope with this? And this is where green infrastructure can really help. And the image top right is experiments we're working on with active airflow, which is drawing air through the roots of the plants, clearing it, and then delivering clean air back into polluted spaces, whether that's in offices, classrooms, hospitals, etc. It's about using nature to provide that clean air into those spaces. So let's have a look at some different ways of vertical greening as we can kind of do it now. And I'm going to start with this extraordinary building in Milan, the Bosco Verticale. I think it's just outrageous and I love it to bits. And it's essentially horizontal landscaping out on terraces to create this vertical structure. And it's just inspiring, in my opinion. And I think, you know, we start to look at some of the real benefits that the plants will give in terms of ameliorating temperatures up in these spaces. And so that for me is a wonderful example of how we should be working with, or could be working with, green in spaces. The standard kind of ways of vertical greening. From left to right, we have plants growing up buildings, so using the building to grow. And I'm not going to go into that in more detail because it's not something that we work with. It's not something it's more of a sort of natural feature of a wisteria or an ivy growing up a building. It could have structural issues because it's latching onto the building to do various bits and pieces. It kind of goes where it wants to go. We've all seen examples of it, absolutely beautiful. But we've also, if we're in our workplace and we're specifying buildings for other people, it kind of gives everybody a bit of a shudder to think of green just being allowed to grow up the fabric of a building without there being some sort of framework in which to do that. So the three areas I want to focus on are the climbers, which are in number 2, the kind of trough system in number 3, and then number 4, which is fully comprehensive living wall systems. So looking at the climbers up at cables and wires, there's real opportunity for these to be absolutely fabulous on buildings. I think, so the image on the bottom left is some work we did at a car park just to green up that space. Originally individual cables and wires, and now it's forming a complete ivy screen. At the top you have the jasmine growing up cables and wires, and on the right you have a much larger building and the ability for this more diffuse type of greening. There are some real benefits of this type of greening. One of the places that I really like this is almost like as a natural brise soleil on buildings, where we can go in front of windows. For example, if we're using deciduous plants on a south-facing elevation, we can allow for those plants or the leaves of those plants to disappear in winter to allow the light levels through, but in summer for the full growth to allow only diffuse light to come through. This will have impact on primary energy costs because obviously the air conditioning requirements will be reduced by the natural element of the brise soleil. And this is just using an old technique of using nature to overhang buildings, but we can do that deliberately with cables and wires. It's not done enough, in my opinion, and as we focus more and more buildings on air conditioning, full air conditioned sealed units, whereas there's much more we could be doing with nature. When we talk about ivy screens, we've all seen these, often on construction site hoardings, sometimes surrounding schools. They are great barriers for air pollution reduction, and they're generally pre-grown, so they come already established, and you can do some really interesting things with them. We work with a company in Germany as well called Helix Pflanzen Systems, and they work with these ivy screens to clad whole buildings or to provide an external skin to the cladding of the buildings, which I think is a really nice way of dealing with those. So moving on into box systems, which is more sort of troughs growing up, troughs being placed on the wall, and then plants growing in a much more natural horizontal environment. We tend to find, actually, it's interesting, we tend to find that even when we grow fully comprehensive walls with the plants growing out of the wall, the root systems still understand gravity and they still grow downwards. So this sort of recognition by plants of where light is, where gravity is really awe-inspiring, I think, to witness. And so we've got these sort of open trough systems where we can start to think about how we can do that. We've also got a more closed trough system. This is a trough system that we use at Biotecture called Plant Box. It's a stackable modular trough. It just happens that the troughs are very interlinked, and so it starts to become more akin to a fully comprehensive living wall system. One of the big benefits about a system like Plant Box, for example, is that as the water comes down, each of the troughs has a reservoir in them. So the water's overflowing into the next reservoir. It's a bit like a rainwater butt or a series of rainwater butts, such that you can start to store up to 15 litres per square metre within the living wall. And this is really good interesting for two reasons. One is resilience of the living wall in terms of time needed between watering, but also potential for stormwater attenuation. And in terms of the transformational effects, I've got a couple of videos in this presentation. So the first one here is going to show Plant Box in action on a construction site hoarding. One of the interesting things about this sort of more trough type basis is that there's potential for it to be used in temporary situations like construction site hoardings, and then moved on either to another hoarding or donated to local charities, donated to local schools or local community groups, because the troughs can be reused. And we think that's a really important part of the whole sustainability agenda that sits around some of this. So I'll just play this video and then we'll carry on. I think the reusable nature of the plant boxes and the way that it works really allows for us to think about circular economy, but also to start to think about green infrastructure as an asset to be nurtured rather than a liability to be maintained. And I think this is the way that this is definitely the way we're starting to talk to clients now. We want to see what we provide as assets. And in that, it's interesting because we need to nurture and improve an asset. And sometimes we need to start thinking about changing it, depending on whether we're looking at air pollution reduction or biodiversity habitats, etc., etc. As we move on into more fully comprehensive living wall systems, I've got on the screen our system, our biopanel system, our naturally resilient biopanel system. There are others. There are soil-based systems, there are pocket systems, and each of them does a job of providing fully comprehensive living walls, which is basically plants across a wall to provide, hopefully, 100% coverage of green. Each of these is supported by an irrigation system. And you can go all the way from a tap timer right up to our preferred method, which is remote sensed irrigation systems, where we can control off-site, we can monitor off-site, and we can change the irrigation cycles as we wish. And I'm going to go into more detail about how this works in the compliance and delivery webinar. A couple of examples of where we can use fully comprehensive living walls. One is going to be on a retrofit building, and the other one is in new build. When we talk about new build, we can also consider the range screen cladding element. We can consider the living wall as being a range screen cladding element of the building. In that sense, it's replacing whatever might be the range screen cladding that you might have thought of on the building. The living wall can be an irrigated, planted range screen cladding. So firstly, retrofit. This is a building we retrofitted in 2017. Working with Capital and Counties, now Shaftesbury Capital, opposite Covent Garden Tube Station. And the existing building was a brick building that they were considering demolishing. And we were asked to come and have a look and work and see what we could do. We had to work with the structural engineer and the frame to make sure that we are tapping back into the main frame rather than just fixing to the facade of the building. So we're looking at how that works. And on site, you can see here how we're tapping back into that framework. And the original requirement was for a 5-year temporary planning permission to be put onto this green wall while they thought about how they were going to redevelop that building. And so we go through the process in our nursery of putting the panels up, planting those panels. There's 2 reasons why we plant up in a nursery. I think they're both really important. The main one is to get good root growth in an environment in which we can manage it very simply with our horticulturists at kind of head height level being the top height level rather than 20, 30 meters up in the air. And the second reason is because there isn't a second chance to make a first impression. And so when living walls go out there, we want them to look absolutely fantastic when they go out there. And so this living wall that we installed on a 5-year temporary planning permission immediately got relevance in the area as a vertical garden in Covent Garden, as the gateway there. The dwell time increased in that space, and the client quickly recognised that actually this was becoming an iconic building within the area. And so now the planning permission has been changed from a 5-year temporary to a full-time permanent. And they see the green wall there very much as an asset in that environment. So moving on to new build, I'm picking an example here from 2014. So some time ago, this is 20 Fenchurch Street, or just under the walkie-talkie building, where we've got a 700+ square metre living wall installed. And we go through the whole design process. Part of the design was around BREEAM, was around habitats, etc., etc., but we're also looking at planting design as well. And then something that I'll go into again in the next webinar is the detail of how this is then fixed back through to the building. But essentially, in the picture on the left, you've got cladding rails, you've got a backing board, which is a waterproof backing board. And on the right-hand side, you've got drainage shear textile, and you've got certain rails and the irrigation system that's there to take the living wall panels. And on install, this is what the living wall looks like. And this is why we pre-grow in the nursery, because we're able to get this fantastic look and feel. Yes, it looks a little bit juvenile, but at the same time, it's already got that full look to it. And then over the years, we can start to think about how we sculpt and change that. And so in 20 Fenchurch, this is a picture taken this month. So this is at 9 years old. 2 years ago, as a precursor to the New Street Square winning the award, this project won the Skyline Trophy Award winner at Flowers in the City. And we're really pleased and proud with what we can do here. So that's kind of fully comprehensive living walls. The extension for us as to where that goes is again around the ecosystem services, particularly focused around biodiversity. And we like this idea of vertical forests. So we understand that living walls need to look good. We understand that they need to have this really good level of coverage, but we also want them to be able to do more. And we want to be able to sometimes introduce deciduous species. And so on this project in Leeds, which is a very large project, it's 1,800 square metres, 60,000 plants almost, and nearly 750 habitat boxes. We've also got deciduous plants creating small microclimates. And some of the habitat boxes look like this. And, you know, we're really focusing on habitats for bug hotels, solitary bees, ladybirds, lacewings, almost food stations for birds and bats. And we've started to really start to promote this idea of vertical forests within the ultra-urban zones of London and other cities. And we really want to take this forward a little bit more. Just this year, we've installed in Regent's Place with British Land and Maylim, this akin to a vertical forest. We're starting to, and it's very small. It's only completed this year, so it's going to grow into its jungly look. But we're able to design in their habitat boxes. We're able to design into their larger troughs that are able to take larger plants, which may mean that when people look at living walls at certain times of the year, there may be patches that are slightly barer, but the idea is to start to really tap into our need to create a network of green spaces for biodiversity. And that isn't just about aesthetics, it's also about providing hideaway habitats for various species. Compliance is another thing I'm going to touch on in the next webinar, but it wouldn't be right not to talk about compliance. I think it's really, really important that we are, as a construction company, particularly as a cladding company, that we start to look at the appropriate levels of compliance of our product within the environments in which we place it. So for us, this means that we need to go through the same testing as if we were a cladding company without plants and irrigation. I was going to say a boring cladding company, but I don't necessarily mean that. But a cladding company that is smooth and dry, that just has panels, we need to go through the same testing regime as that to prove that we are a cladding company that can deliver, as well as providing the fluffy stuff that goes on the edge of buildings. It's really important that we show that level of compliance. So we've actually had to go above and beyond, because green walls are seen with slight suspicion, particularly around the fire issue, where it's very, very difficult from a non-conforming material to go the extra mile to demonstrate the full compliance, even though we believe that there's ways in which we have done so. And so I won't go down that rabbit hole in this presentation, but I probably will in the next one. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions around the compliance of product. But I also want to talk about the compliance, the benefit compliance that we can offer as well, which I think is really, really important to now think about. And again, we come back to all those holistic reasons of why green infrastructure, and we start to think about some of the factors that are being put in place that will help developers to do the right thing, I think is the only way I can put it. But sometimes it needs compliance factors. But I do know things like developers who are being more sustainable and more green have access to cheaper funding because they're being more green. But there's also things like the urban greening factor in London, and we work as consultants, working with either architects or landscape architects or directly with clients to maximise urban greening factor. We're now increasingly starting to work with clients on biodiversity net gain, which I believe gets royal assent in November this year. And then there's a lot of other sort of standards and compliance standards that I think are really good, because these allow us to deliver green infrastructure. I think we should go further with compliance. I think there should be government grants on green infrastructure in terms of putting that into cities, and it should be much more. There should be much more flag waving around green infrastructure and the benefits that come from it. Yes, it has to be safe, and yes, it has to be compliant, but let's also focus on the benefits that it can give us as well. So in terms of those benefits, I'm going to just kind of come towards a close on the presentation by just going through 3 areas where we've demonstrably added value with green infrastructure. The first one of these is an internal environment. This is Gate 25, Terminal 3, Heathrow Airport, and we were asked to have a look at this environment. It's a what psychologists would call a non-space. So there's no natural light into this space. Essentially, you could be anywhere in the world. And all airports have quality score systems, and they match themselves against each other. So the quality score systems are very similar. And they measure these with happy face, sad face machines in different environments, and also with questionnaires too. And so this departure gate was the 3rd worst scoring departure gate in Heathrow in terms of people's satisfaction with being in that environment. And so we turned it into a garden gate. We worked with Heathrow. We put multiple green walls within that space. We had to use LED lighting because there was no natural light available. It's actually really quite cheap from a cost point of view to power LED lighting of the right spectrum for green walls, but the value you get back from it is multiple times the cost that goes into it. And one of the other things that we did that I think was really useful was to provide information about the plant, so that when people are in the space, and particularly children actually, they could go and see a picture of a plant and then go and find it on the living wall and read a little bit about it. Some of these plants are medicinal. Others of them are kind of there for other reasons as well, in terms of air pollution reduction or whatever else it might be. So just engaging with people is really, really important. And every time we install some green infrastructure, I always advocate for some signage to go next to it to explain a bit about the green infrastructure, what's in it, why it went there, and hopefully the benefits that it's giving to people. And within this happy fat sad face machine, 3 months before installation, it was in there, and it showed that people were either were 47% positive or very positive about the space. After the installation, in the 3 months following, people are 72% positive or very positive about the space, which is an enormous shift in that sort of 6 month period. And in that 6 month period, over 125,000 people flew out of that departure gate. So it's a pretty comprehensive study in terms of health and well-being. And look and feel and health and well-being statistics are often so undervalued when we start to think about placemaking and design. We can think about the thermal impact, we can think about U values, we can think about ventilation strategies because we have numbers for these. But when we come to look and feel and how a building is going to actually operate and make us better or for our own well-being, the data is often ignored. And the data is out there that shows that if we put green spaces in, we will have better buildings, which then leads to better creativity, productivity, staff retention, etc., etc. So that's Heathrow Airport. My second example would be Canary Wharf. Now, Canary Wharf's been in the press a lot recently, obviously with the post-pandemic and some of the people leaving the office spaces. I don't know if everybody's been to Canary Wharf recently, but it is transforming massively. It recognises its need to change as a space and place from a 5-day-a-week workspace into a 7-day-a-week work, rest, live and recreation space. And as part of that, they've invested a lot of time, effort and money. And we've worked with them in 10 different locations, particularly around gateways to Canary Wharf, to introduce green, to introduce spaces where people can sit and relax. We've got multiple living walls, we've got multiple urban parklets that are going in. And this is about the future of Canary Wharf. This is about it really cementing its place in the future. And I believe it's fantastic when you go there now. It's a space, it's a destination space to go to at weekends now. And just 3 examples that's sitting around here. This is on 10 Bank Street. You can see the picture on the left as it was. This is the plant box system because it's really easy to retrofit. And again, cubic steps, creating spaces and places for people to sit. And it's a shame that they're all looking at their phones, I suppose, but it's a place and space for people to sit and be out in nature. And probably my favourite example is this desolate space that's opposite the Elizabeth Line entrance. We've converted it into a full-length green wall. And then there's these urban parklets that have been added in too. And suddenly it becomes a space that's not used to a space that people can use, people can walk past, people can enjoy. And it's not just consciously, it's also the subconscious impact that these have. And so what we're looking at in Canary Wharf is very much placemaking. It's also wayfinding and just ways of reconnecting people with nature in a way that restores them. And Canary Wharf make no secret of the fact that they want to encourage people back in for the non-work environment things that they do, but also people coming back into the office. If they've got a chance to escape out into a park like this, then they're more likely to come back in. And our third example is we saw previously that we'd installed in France earlier this year a project for MacArthur Glen, working with Patrick Blanc. Well, this is one we installed in 2019 in Ashford in Kent. It's a huge project. It's over 2,000 square metres of green walls. And this is to our own design. And we get it to change colour. So colours pop out at different times of year. We've got primroses, for example, in spring that will sit in and just change the colour. And MacArthur Glen are one of those clients who really understand the value of green infrastructure. Their sites are destination spaces, and we work with them to add more and more and more plants. They measure their footfall, and their footfall is linked to their rents. So they charge rents based on the footfall of people into the centres, and we help them with that footfall because we're providing this natural environment that changes throughout the year for people to come and see. And so we've done the one in Ashford, we've done the one in Paris this year, and we're now working on a third centre with them. This time it's in Holland. But as we come towards a close, I think it would be good to see a video that this client put together about Ashford. The video is called The Future of Building. Is this the future of building? It came out in 2019, just after the installation. And the video had over 1 million views on socials within the first week after it came out. So let me just play this one to you now. you got a sneak peek there of the processes that happen in our nursery, and our greenhouse is a wonderful place to visit, and any clients are very welcome to come down and see their living walls growing, see the plants. At any one time we have over 500,000 plants down there, and I know that sometimes when I'm feeling stressed and agitated, just go and walk amongst 500,000 plants just can't fail to make me feel a bit calmer about life. So, you know, as Biotecture, we design, we grow, we install, and we maintain green infrastructure. And the whole purpose of doing what we do is geared towards providing multiple benefits, which in turn will provide return on investment for clients. I'm convinced that green infrastructure, and vertical green infrastructure in particular, is absolutely vital in the future of sustainable cities. It's got to be an integral part such that it's as important to a building to have its right amount of green infrastructure as it is to have a roof. That's the kind of way that we're pushing this now in terms of the importance of our response to the climate emergency. So hopefully that's given you a bit of information. The idea is to inform and to inspire about green infrastructure. And there's lots and lots of data that works around some of the multiple returns on investment that I've put in the previous slide. But with natural environments, it's really difficult to be specific about what a specific project may specifically provide in terms of benefits. We just know it in our hearts that it is. And this is a quote by a Nobel Prize winning psychologist. And it's so true. It is sometimes easier to make the world a better place than to prove you've made the world a better place. And green walls, for me, just absolutely hits that nail on the head. We know we need to prove, and we can do that. And one of the slides that I didn't put up today was a survey we covered off in the winter. There's a particular Monday in January that's dubbed Blue Monday, when the whole nation is supposed to be at its lowest ebb from a mental health point of view. And so we commissioned this survey, and we wanted to turn Blue Monday green. We surveyed 2,000 urban residents and asked them what they thought about green. And really fascinating results. 75% of people in London said they wanted to see more green in their city. And 81% of respondents said that being in nature or seeing nature improved their mental health. We need to be taking these things into account when we start thinking about placemaking. So love to talk to you some more about data, any particular projects that you want to talk about. We're very, very happy to take offline and deal with that. But are there any questions, Jess, on just that sort of intro to green walls?
Thanks very much, Richard. That was really interesting. A couple of questions in the chat. One from Violetta. How do you maintain alive green walls facing north or shaded by surrounding buildings without the need for UV lighting or other external resources? Can any plant species survive under these conditions when they're never seeing much sun?
That's a great question, and I would point back to 20 Fenchurch Street, which is over 700 square metres, 9 years old, north-facing, and it completely overshadowed by buildings. It only gets sun in the top left-hand corner of it for about 6 weeks of the year, and the right-hand side gets no sun at all. And if you go and see that wall, as you did earlier this month, Jess, to take the photographs, it's a very full-looking living wall. One thing I would say is that the environment there has dictated the plant choice. So some of the plants that we installed back in 2014, particularly those with high levels of colour, have had to, well, the plants lose their colour a bit if the light levels start to diminish. And so, you know, it's a little bit of experiment sometimes, or it was in those days. We now know exactly what to put in those environments. But absolutely, in fact, north-facing living walls, I think, with grasses and ferns, can be some of the most beautiful textural walls that we put in. They require fewer maintenance visits because the plants don't grow so much, and they require less water because the conditions aren't as aggressive as a south-facing living wall. So we actually really like working on north-facing living walls.
Another question, how many times a year do your living walls need maintenance? And that's a question for both for biopanel and plant box.
Yes, so nominally 2 to 4 times a year. So the north facing example I was talking about, Fenchurch Street, would be twice a year. It doesn't need any more than that. Whereas south facing environments need four times a year. And sometimes for clients, we are increasing the number of visits to maybe 5, but it really doesn't need any more than that. If you think about the number of times you have a haircut in a year, it's pretty similar type of environment. And so I'd say that sort of time. In terms of plant box, exactly the same in terms of horticultural visits. In terms of watering, because of the water reservoirs there, externally plant box needs watering about 30 times per year, and it's much more in summer than it is in winter. Internally, something like plant box with the water reservoir only needs watering once a month, so once every 4 weeks or so. So from a maintenance point of view, it's kind of, we're trying to make them as self-sustained as possible. Yeah.
Slightly more complicated one, which we might answer in the next webinar.
Okay.
But if the building is retrofitted with a green wall, so for example, a Wriggle House, how do you meet Part L requirements when the green wall steel substructure is fixed to the existing external wall surface, because there might be a potential thermal bridge problem?
Wow, that is a detailed question, isn't it, on design? I think
we could take it offline.
I think
we
should
could
take that one
pop
offline.
back a
And I think I'd
response
also like to introduce Steve Borman into that one, Jess, Steve's our lead designer, and be very happy to take you through that, and actually will know more than I will in terms of those sorts of details. But absolutely, yes, in terms of conforming with the different parts of the approved document and what have you. Yeah. And Jess, please hook Steve Borman up on that one, I think.
We will do. We'll respond directly back to you on that one. And then that was it, actually. So do you want to just tell us quickly about, if anybody's interested in finding more information, where they might be able to find some more?
Well, I guess they find it on our website. Why don't you tell them, Jess, because I'm not.
Well, we got it in a few places. We've got a great website. I'm just going to pop the details in the chat, which just takes you to our website. We also are on MBS Source for the architects among you, and we're also on Specified By, which has got a little bit more information about both our systems. So I'll just pop those in the chat now for you to find at a later date.
Yeah, MBS Source, we've got all the compliance documents. We're totally open with how we are with our compliance, specification details, drawing details, but also a whole load of case studies as well on there, which are, to inspire in terms of different environments. And I'm pretty sure we talk about which ones are north facing, which ones are east and west and south facing. So that's a great environment to go and have a look at areas that might be akin to what you're looking at. The other thing I would say is we, like that Part L comment, for any more detailed questions or any projects that you might be considering, we do work on a initial consultancy basis, is completely free of charge in terms of looking at, is it practical? How would this work in this sense? It's only when we start getting into site-specific issues that we start to think about, hang on a second, we need to start thinking about where we fit in the consultancy or the design of this one. But please feel free to reach out to us with any questions at any stage. I always find over the years worked in Biotecture, which is 15, 16 now, that every time we get engaged in a project at an early stage, the end result is better than when we get engaged at a later stage. It becomes more integrated, and the look and feel of the whole building will be so much better in that way. So, yes.
Someone's just asked about CPD certificates. If anybody would like one, please do drop us an email and I can pop you one over. We do have 2 more webinars coming up in the series, which again I will pop in the chat the details. We've got one on bringing life to buildings, which is a more detailed look at that biopanel system and how to really design living cladding. And then we have one on making places better naturally, which is looking at more kind of retrofit and really urban regeneration. How can we make spaces better using using green infrastructure.
Brilliant.
Great.
Well,
I think unless anybody has anything else they're desperately burning to say, we'll finish up there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're looking for green champions, for people to take this world of green infrastructure as a vital part of the sustainable urban futures that we all share. And we'd love to talk about it to you more. So please do just get in touch through our website or through inquiries, or however you want to get in touch. But that's been brilliant today. I hope you've been inspired by it. I hope it's informed you in terms of different types of green walls and where and when they might be applicable. Appreciates the whistle stop tour, so please do talk to us again. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure actually wandering through the world of green walls and what we can do. Thanks, guys.
Bye.